Hello and welcome to the first of our new series, Manufacturing Xperts, brought to you by our friends at Expert Rule Software. The government's commitment for the UK economy to reach net zero by 2050 is one of those history-shaping events that forces business leaders to make some potentially life-changing decisions. The most fundamental, of course, is to decide whether net zero is an opportunity or a challenge to be met with grudging reluctance. History tells us that companies who do embrace events like this as opportunities will win the race, and the reluctant ones will fall by the wayside. So what are those who do want to change, but are perhaps held back by a business, financial or policy environment that isn't tuned to the needs of long-term focused businesses such as manufacturers? In a minute, we'll be discussing the opportunity side of the issue, but first I'm joined by Dave Atkinson of Lloyds Bank to talk about where UK manufacturers are on their net zero journey. Dave, Lloyds did some seriously significant research into this. Would it be fair to say that you found there's something of a gap between manufacturers' desire to go for net zero and their ability to execute on that?
I don't think there's a huge gap in terms of long-term capability, and certainly our research has indicated that many of the manufacturers that we've been working with and we spoke to are already making some significant progress on this journey towards net zero. 6% have already achieved net zero, which is an amazing achievement when you think of the challenges that those small businesses have to manage. They just don't have the time, the resources, the money, and sometimes the expertise around them to achieve some of these challenges that have been set out. And yet 6% have already got there, and almost half have already set net zero targets to get there. So I think there's a lot of work for many still to do, without a shadow of a doubt. A huge proportion of them that aren't close to achieving net zero yet know how important it is. They understand the challenges that they face. They just need a little bit of help in getting there. And in terms of the costs to achieve this, I think they all acknowledge that it's a huge and a really important challenge to us all. It is a challenge, but equally there's some huge opportunities in this for those that take the steps to even just begin that journey. And there are some clear indications of growth opportunities and some recruitment opportunities of new skills for those that demonstrate they're prepared to take some steps to start to achieve this and work towards that challenge of net zero by 2050.
Dave, you said that manufacturers are already doing a lot for themselves, and there is a lot they can do for themselves. And you as a bank, you're helping with specific, targeted and enhanced help as well on the finance side. But is there something more that the government should be doing to underpin what is a very significant policy change being faced by the manufacturing sector?
We did talk to manufacturers about what more needed to be done to support them, and they were quite clear. I think a third more were expecting support from government and from other sort of policymakers to influence change, to support them on that journey. And the report details all of those asks, from the very simple things like removing the policy traps which prevent expanded investment into things like solar panels, where if you're receiving a feed-in tariff above a certain level, if you're investing in more solar panels, there's a risk that you could lose some of that feed-in tariff, and that they didn't necessarily expect a greater tariff benefit, but what they did want it to do was retain what they'd been given, but be allowed to invest in further solar electricity generation, which reduces their carbon footprint and reduces their costs. So I think there is without doubt a call upon government to support further. There's lots of initiatives that was detailed in there, but equally they do recognise that a lot of this they can and need to do themselves in order to stay competitive and to take advantage of new opportunities in the market.
Dave Atkinson of Lloyds, demonstrating there are multiple routes to net zero, even if some of them require change that lies beyond the sector's immediate control. On now to our panel discussion. I'm joined by Professor Ian Crossley, Director of Manufacturing at Expert Rules Software, and his fellow manufacturing experts. Professor Alan Norbury, who's Chief Technologist at Siemens Digital Industries, David Hart, Director at Energy Intelligence Solutions, and Andy Dorset, Director of R&D at Procter & Gamble. Ian, if I can start the conversation with you. Listening back to Dave Atkinson, he was being broadly positive in what Lloyds Bank found about manufacturers' intent regarding net zero, but clearly there's a gap between that positive intent and realising those very ambitious targets.
It's a good point, Nick, and I think it's absolutely right. People realise how important these changes are. However, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about where to start, how to start and what to do. And I think this is where it becomes important that people look for the best solutions that are out there and are actually prepared to collaborate with people. And by so doing, they can actually get the best solutions for them and the best understanding of the situations that are available.
We're going to look at that in a bit more detail, but let's just talk, Ian, about let's break down what kind of net zero targets we're talking about. Net zero in terms of process, what under the protocol, they're really scopes 1 and 2, is one thing. And some companies, as Dave Atkinson was saying, are already achieving it. But scope 3 is the really big one. And that's why it's going to take until 2050 in terms, I suppose, product. It's an altogether different ambition. It's the one that's going to take big structural change, isn't it?
Well, Scope 3 is the real difficult one. Scopes 1 and 2 are relatively straightforward for people to achieve. Scope 3 really comes back to thinking about your whole business, how you're conducting your business, where you're conducting your business, where your supply chain is, who your suppliers are, and also how you can maintain a competitive advantage with all those constraints. So it really is a difficult and challenging area, and it needs a complete new thought process around the business, around the technology, and around about the people.
Well, let's turn to some of our experts and look at ways we can address that. David Hart, I mean, energy usage, obviously, it's the first thing people think of, perhaps the most obvious thing, issue confronting manufacturers when it comes to net zero. We're in a really critical time of runaway energy pricing thanks to war, shortages and so on. What are the tools you recommend to manufacturers to get a grip on energy costs?
It's a very good point. I mean, energy costs have doubled and tripled, and it's to some extent taken the pressure away from people to drive to net zero. There's a lot of focus on profitability and costs, and I mean, net zero has two problems. It has the need for big investment, and at the moment it comes with increased operating costs. So I mean, one of the principal tools is to find ways to make the best of what you've got, to drive energy efficiency of existing equipment, and that's where sort of digital solutions, better analysis of data, systems to better manage equipment comes into play.
I wonder about those savings that you say that if people work on it, they can achieve it. But obviously, there's a lot more than just energy usage. There's very basic stuff that people might have been in days when comparatively energy was cheaper, might have ignored, such as insulation and all that sort of thing. Is that where you get involved, or are you at the sharp end of the drive to net zero?
I mean, I think that is partly the sharp end. I mean, the correct approach to achieving net zero is to start with improving efficiency and reducing your consumption, and then seeking ways to reduce the carbon emissions of the utilities that you need after that. So, I mean, there is a renewed focus on the more traditional solutions, the straightforward solutions, switching things off, simple stuff, insulation, like you say. There's a much renewed focus on improving process operations, improving the control of processes. I've been in the business for 30 years. All the things that we did 30 years ago to save energy are now really important starting points for the net zero journey. And if you get that right, you you reduce the amount of effort needed to decarbonise the remaining energy demands, and you reduce the investment required for those changes.
I wonder if it's almost like if we accept the fact that net zero is a journey, it's a multi-year, multi-decade journey. I suppose, Ian, if I can just come back to you, I suppose that energy is going to be among the very first steps to take, and it's not a bad place to start because that is one place where you can use digital technologies to fine-tune and mitigate some of your energy usage.
So energy usage is really one of the easy gains for people. And a lot of companies you talk to actually don't know how they use the energy. They know how much energy they may use, but they don't know where they use it. And getting the insight into where they use it, and how they operate is vitally important to them. So it is a really good place to start. And it's probably one of the easier challenges to unravel.
Well, Alan, if I can come to you, we've just been celebrating earlier this summer a great success story, Siemens Congleton achieving net zero on process, which was a terrific milestone to reach. When it comes to the adoption of digital technologies, and of course Siemens at Congleton again has been something of a standout in its use of digital technologies to achieve this operational excellence. But people think in terms of IT. But what about operational technology? To what extent is getting the right systems in place as part of your manufacturing processes a key part of the solution?
Yeah, I think it stems back to getting the strategy right initially. So for most manufacturers, traditionally it's about cost quality delivery. That changed quite a few years back for Siemens in Congleton, where we changed that to become cost quality delivery sustainability, not necessarily in that order. And each one of those KPIs are not exclusive either, by the way. So if you increase productivity, quite possibly there's a good chance you're going to reduce the energy per product that you produce. So that's one way of looking at it. I think the other thing that we've taken great strides with is the use of virtualization and modeling. And you think, well, how does that relate to saving energy, reducing the carbon footprint? Well, a number of times I've seen conveyors running in a factory with nothing on them. If you model a factory process, you can identify any parts of that process that actually aren't required in the manufacturing process at a particular time, which means you can actually put those devices, those machines, that it might be ovens, whatever it may be, into a standby mode. So you're actually taking less energy, but you're still increasing productivity at the same time. And this is why we start to use digital tools to identify those areas, to switch certain devices off when not needed. So that was absolutely essential. I think other areas like lightweighting of products, so that they take less energy in production, less materials. And when they're actually in use on a final product, they don't use as much energy. And I think also we were quite lucky with Congleton. I mean, we hit the carbon neutrality target 8 years ahead of our original plan target, and that's not been one thing in isolation. It's been a combination of different ways of doing things, engaging with the local community. We have a river near the factory, and we've developed a process with the local community of gaining energy from that river using Archimedes screw. So there's lots and lots of different things that we've actually done to reduce our energy costs, which reduces our carbon footprint.
That really does come down to a holistic view of the business, doesn't it? Because I think some might choose to see the net zero thing as a project that sort of runs alongside everything else. So we'll deal with our net zero stuff now, but actually net zero is part of everything you do there at Congleton.
Absolutely. And supply chain. And the one that sticks in my mind, we did quite a while back, was all the goods that come into our factory have cardboard boxes, and obviously all the packing that goes with it. So we started to work with our supply chain to say, would it be possible to provide your products without all the packaging? And the way that we achieved that, we had these standard tote boxes with RFID tags on them. So when the products come into the factory, we have RFID portals, and obviously all the tote boxes can be stacked on top of each other, and we can still, you don't need line of sight for RFID identification. So we knew straight away what products were coming in the factory, and we can keep the products in the tote boxes throughout the movement within the factory. So we got rid of cardboard, got rid of packaging, and that's one of the many steps we've taken towards this sort of objective of reducing our carbon footprint and hit carbon neutral.
Well, I think Congleton is a fantastic case study, and we'll come back to a little later in the conversation. But Andy, if I can turn to you, Procter and Gamble is a huge company. It's got a global commitment to achieving net zero. What's the company saying to their supply chains about working together to get there? Because clearly this is not something that an OEM like Procter and Gamble can do on its own. It's got to involve everybody, surely.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nick. And building on what Alan said as well, I mean, it's sustainability and getting to net zero is embedded in everything we do. So the company has set a target to get to net zero by 2040 from all of our raw material supply chains all the way to the consumer. But specifically on your, what are we doing on supply chains? Can we do it on our own? Absolutely not. And the company has been very overt in terms of what we can do to learn across our internal supply chains. We've already reduced emissions by 50%. We're already buying renewable energy pretty much at 100% now. And we've tried to accelerate a lot of that work going forward. But probably the one thing we have done overtly to kind of really, call out how serious we are about this is we've created, it's called a Product Supply Innovation Center in Germany, where we're working with not only internal experts, but external experts, academia, startup companies, and very much taking an external view that we can't solve this on our own. We need to work on it together and to generate new supply chain innovations that can radically help reduce our carbon footprint going forward.
I love the idea that P&G describes their attitude to net zero as built in, not bolted on, which is rather what I was referring to, what life must be like at Congleton. I know what the work you're involved in some experimental work, Andy, the Argus experiment, and you're working with Ian Crossley at Expert Rule on that. That may not have a direct net zero element to it. You're not doing it for net zero. But tell us a little bit about it and why ultimately this built-in, not bolted-on state of mind means that everything we do is actually going to end up with a net zero imperative.
No, absolutely. I mean, Ian and I are working together on a project called Argus, as you say. This is an Innovate UK funded project through Manufacturing Made Smarter. And it was all about creating an innovative digital solution to solve a real life supply chain problem. And although it wasn't directly linked to net zero, it's actually linked to how we measure microbiology real time and inline. I think what we're learning is the power of digital, the power of using the data that we have in our manufacturing plants, the power of having a sensor that can detect something that can give us some useful information, and then working with Ian's company and the digital platform that we have, how we can integrate that data, process that data, and even look for models and trends to help us better predict issues when they happen or before they happen, hopefully, versus what we've done historically, which is catch them, before we release the product to go to the market. So, and again, although that's a quality issue, if you like, you can use that digital data, I'm sure, to track many different trends, whether it's trying to understand energy efficiency or how to reduce emissions or what's the performance of your plant. So I think we're learning an absolute ton through the collaboration with Ian as well as the Innovate UK project. And indeed, I think it's something we're definitely going to accelerate and roll out for the future.
What you're just describing, Andy, in terms of being able to predict and all of that using the data, waste is an obvious area for all manufacturers to consider. And I imagine that Procter and Gamble, down the years, there has to be waste in order to make certain that everything you put out to the consumer is spot on. Some bits aren't. And that's really what you're talking about right across the board, ultimately, I imagine.
Absolutely. It's all about, reducing losses, reducing waiting time, speeding up our supply chains, whilst obviously also, eliminating, unnecessary work. So, in the spirit of what we're talking here on net zero, one of the things we do quite deliberately and regularly is, cleaning and sanitization of our equipment. But by using the digital data, we can actually better target when and how we choose to do that, so, as opposed to a fixed frequency. And of course, the way we clean and sanitize is lots of water, lots of heat, which of course, has some impact on the net zero challenge that we have. So if we can better target that using our digital data, our inline sensors to predict when we need to do it, as opposed to we just do it every month, then that will obviously lead to better savings, better predictability, more throughput, better efficiency in our manufacturing processes.
Ian, I imagine that working with Procter and Gamble, you guys too are also learning about how your artificial intelligence based software programs are actually able to develop this much more rounded and much more efficient process for all manufacturers, not just OEMs.
Yeah, we're learning a lot, and I think the thing that really is key to this is working with people who understand these processes. So when we go into these, having the domain experts working alongside us as a provider of the technology is the way we get the best out of this. And I think both Alan and Andy have referred to this all the way through. You have to change the culture of the company to get the best out of it. And changing that culture and getting everybody from shop floor through to board level involved is really, really important. So having those insights from different people who really understand the business and can put different viewpoints to it is hugely important. And we're learning from that all the time. And we're also learning that we can apply our technology in different ways. So there's a big learning curve for everybody.
David, you work with companies very much. Your role is increasingly important as more and more companies map out their net zero journeys. This point about culture, is it something that you've run across as being all important when it comes to implementing some of the solutions that you devise and implement for companies?
Yeah, culture is really important. I mean, we've seen over recent years that it's become much more commonplace that everybody in an organization wants to reduce energy and reduce carbon emissions. So I think there's been a step change. But I mean, over the years, we've seen that one of the biggest barriers to improving energy and carbon performance has been a fear of what it might do to the rest of the process. Operators, engineers won't change the way things happen because they're frightened it will affect waste, it will affect productivity, it'll affect quality. Using data and digital solutions can help to overcome that. It allows you to understand the different objectives and constraints. And if you use data in a way that brings along an organization, brings along the people in an organization so they can understand from the data in the way that you're, as a domain expert, are understanding the data, then that really helps. If people buy into the conclusions that you're coming to, then that has a really significant impact.
Alan, we've kind of bigged up Siemens Congleton as something of a great case study in this, but how did the culture change, or sorry, not how did the culture change, but how did the culture evolve so that everybody was pointing in the same direction when it came to achieving your net zero goals?
I think one of the differences, I think, over the years has been that traditionally everything has been driven from the top down, and that's been completely inverted now, where people on the shop floor, they are the people that actually understand the process better than anybody else. So we have these Gemba meetings every morning. They take the initiative of feeding back issues they've had the day before. They take ownership, they're rewarded for that, and they get support from the management team. So it's an inverted organisation in terms of strategy. I think one of the things that's really important, I think, in terms of reducing carbon footprint is some of those quick wins, some of the obvious ones that maybe we don't always consider. And the one that I always think of is I walk into a factory and I always look at the ceiling, and you'll see quite often a rotating fan extracting air. And usually they'll have a louver there to control the airflow. So it's going at the same speed consistently, and you're probably using more energy than you need to. So, in many cases, we'd advise replacing that with something that can control the speed of the fan, like a variable speed drive, for example, and that's a quick win. I think the other areas of concern are older machines. So you'll find there's a lot of factories out there that are very proud to be running their machines that are 30, 40, 50 years old in some cases, not connected to anything, don't have communication connectivity. However, there are ways of optimizing those machines by putting small, low-cost devices. It doesn't have to be expensive. And so, for example, we've been working with Ian with Expert Rule with a Siemens, what we call a nano controller. It's called a Logo, and it's just a few inputs, few outputs, about £100. You can gather the data from sensors off the machine, and then working with Ian with Expert Rule, you can actually analyze that data to optimize the machine to reduce energy costs, increase productivity, etc. So it doesn't have to break the bank to start on that journey to reduce your carbon footprint, and there's lots of examples where the other thing that we've not been very good at in the UK is sharing best practice. There are lots of companies out there doing these things already, and I think we need to get better at doing those sorts of things to say, well, look, we've done this before. This is with the savings. You can do exactly the same without reinventing the wheel. And I think that's really important.
Ian, this must be music to your ears. A number of times you and I have talked about, the digital elephant. Do you eat it all at once, or do you eat it a toe at a time? Well, of course, what Alan's saying is absolutely from the same hymn book, isn't it? That you don't have to go down this journey all at once. You can take it a bite size at a time.
I think it's very important that you have a phased approach to it, because you need to understand what you're doing, what you're trying to achieve, and how you're trying to achieve it. So running behind all these people's ideas, that they need a plan, they need a map of what they're doing and how they're going to get there and how they're going to achieve it. And I think Alan's point is very valid, is dipping your toe in the water in the first place to see what digital technology can do for you is difficult. Where do you start? What do you do? And how do you go about it? So having simple devices and simple solutions that can be deployed very, very is an ideal way of doing it. And it isn't cost prohibitive then. The problem's been a lot of people have gone for enterprise solutions, gone from the top down, got to the OT level and suddenly realised it doesn't work. So I think having this approach and trying things bit by bit is absolutely spot on.
I was just going to say, to add to that, one of the things that's been driven hard in our factory in Colington, that Andrew Peters, the managing director, always explains to me, is that you have to have an efficient process before you digitalise, because if you've got an inefficient process and you digitalise it, it'll be just a digital inefficient process. So I think you have to take a step back first to make sure the processes you're all looking at to digitalise are as efficient as possible, as lean as possible first, and then apply digitalisation. You gain far greater benefits in doing it in that order.
I want to pick up on two issues that came out of the Lloyds Bank report, because I think they're really important. And what I said in the introduction about the fact that, there's an awful lot manufacturers do have at their fingertips, and sometimes, as you've just described, they may not know they're at their fingertips, but with just a little bit of collaboration and a bit of sharing, they can find those solutions. But the stuff beyond their control, number one, skills. That is going to be a huge issue, and also government assistance and whatever. There was in the Lloyds Bank report, somebody said there needs to be a roadmap, and there needs to be recognised standards so that employees can be, everybody's going to be judged on the same level, and so everybody knows where they are, because the road to net zero is something that consumers are going to be looking at as well as manufacturers. So let's start number one with, can the government do more? Ian, jump in on this. What's your view at Expert Rule?
So I suppose there's an Expert Rule view, and there's my opinion as well, which align to some extent. And I think there is far more the government can do to aid with this. And one of the simple things they could do is to go back and revisit their industrial strategy, which they published a few years ago and then canned. And I think having documents like that is really, really important. And I think also them engaging with people who really understand these challenges, not at a high level, but at an actual level that people are working at, and companies and the challenges that they're facing to deploy these is important. Because as you said, there's a cost element to this, there's a competitiveness element to it, and there's the people element to it. So all of these are important, and there needs to be some mechanisms to address these, and some targets where the government can be seen to be giving help.
Does anybody else think that some kind of, I'm just throwing this out there, but some kind of kite mark or some kind of standard where you are externally judged is wise? And is that going to be something that's going to help manufacturers on their journeys say, yeah, well, I've reached net zero level 3 or whatever? What are your thoughts?
I think if there's an incentive to do that, then yes, I think there's a piece of work for the government to do to give people incentive to do that. I know it's the right thing to do, and you should be doing it anyway, but I think that would also help. I think the one thing that we've learned from is that you can't do it on your own. You know, it's really important that you do in collaboration with other organisations. We do a lot of work with the high value manufacturing catapult centres. You think Siemens will be able to do all this ourselves? Well, no, we learn from others. And that's one of the great things that the government has done by supporting the catapult centres, because those people have the skills, they have the technology, they have the connections, they encourage collaboration. And as I said before, more importantly, sharing best practice. So they've done it once, they can do it again quicker and then quicker and then quicker. And we get there a lot faster, rather than everybody having to start from scratch on their own.
David Hart, Energy Intelligence Solutions, I imagine that some kind of metrics would help you as you're trying to help companies, not just get started on their net zero journey, but accelerate.
I'm a little bit sceptical about more standards and more targets. I mean, we've had in the past standards, the sort that you refer to, I think most companies are on the right track and have the right attitude, and we still do have standards. I mean, we still have climate change agreements, with targets for manufacturing companies. For example, we have ISO 50001, which is a standard for energy efficiency and so on. So I guess I'm more in favour of allowing companies to get on with it, companies are very different. I mean, some companies have a very hard time decarbonising, and for others it's much more simple. So, if you think about those companies that have a lot of high temperature heat, it's much more difficult for them. So I think it's difficult to compare, and I guess I'm in favour of letting companies progress without standards.
Andy at Procter and Gamble, you in many ways are actually setting the standards.
To some extent, yeah. I mean, I think I speak on behalf of a large company and a global company, and yeah, I mean the company has got very serious about setting its own internal targets of what we want to meet and hopefully beat. But it's also working with other external agencies and governments, particularly in the US, around making sure what we can do to accelerate the journey to net zero, and that goes across literally everything that we touch in the supply chain. As I said at the beginning, from our raw material supply chains, what we can do to help them, or in this kind of scope 3 area, all the way through to consumers, which is probably where our biggest carbon footprint is in consumer use of our products. So there's a lot of work we can do, educating consumers, helping consumers, reduce their carbon footprint. But so it really goes end to end. I'll give you one example in the UK. We've just you've probably seen a lot of advertising on turning down the temperature at which you wash your clothes. So if you can wash at 30 degrees instead of 50, 60, or even 40, you can massively reduce the impact on carbon footprint. So the company, as I said, is very much integrated. Everything we do on sustainability and the journey to net zero touches everything from manufacturing all the way through to supply chain, all the way through to working with our suppliers and external agencies, so that we are hopefully being seen as good citizens in what we're doing on the journey to net zero.
Ian, a final point. I just want to pick up on the laudable goals that Procter and Gamble have set themselves in their supply chain. They want to work with their supply chain partners. I imagine, though, that there are going to be some larger companies who are going to mandate change to their supply chain partners who might have to hurry up in order to comply, which is not obviously as great a relationship as P&G have with their teams. What would you say to companies to perhaps help them just assess the risk of being left behind? What would you say to an SME who fears that perhaps they may find some directive coming down the pike which is going to leave them stranded?
It's a good question, that. And I think the answer depends very much on the attitude of that company and their aims and their goals. And I think there's two types of company in here, really. There's those who really just concentrate on what they're doing day in, day out, and they just deliver whatever they've got to do, and they consider the sort of just-in-time delivery, the pressures they're doing without considering their processes. They just get on and do it. And those ones are the ones which are potentially going to fail. The other side are the ones who are willing to learn. And I think, what P&G have done and what Siemens are doing as well is great with their supply chains. They're actually coaching the supply chains to adapt. And I think the SMEs who listen to these people are the ones who are going to succeed. And Andy and Alan both brought out this collaboration. These things don't happen without collaboration. There's no sort of golden solution to it. There's nothing that's going to give everybody the right answers. So really looking at the high-value manufacturing catapults for guidance, looking at the people you're supplying, and looking at best practice is the only way you're going to adapt. So it is important that they do it. And I think, those that don't won't be here is probably the long shot.
Well, in many ways, that's actually how we started the whole discussion. So it's probably a decent place to end it. Thank you all very much indeed for taking part with this. And thank you indeed for watching. I hope you've gleaned some real insights into manufacturing's net zero journey. On behalf of the Manufacturing Experts, I'm Nick Peters. Thank you for being with us.